By evening, the bell was ringing more often than usual. People closed their shutters before sunset. In the square, bowls of vinegar and clay were brought out to the benches, as if these smells could stop the fever. Signs of sin written in charcoal appeared on the doors of the bathhouse. Old men gathered around the fires whispered that the trouble had come because of a dissolute life, and that only a strict hand could eradicate the root of evil. At the crossroads leading to the slaughterhouse, the water in the ditch was murky, and strips of fat glistened in it. These strips stretched to the moat under the walls, where water carriers filled their barrels. A cloth with knots hung in the window of the midwife's house. Each knot represented a name and age. The knots multiplied. I am glad to see you here. I am a man, your storyteller. Tell me where you are watching this video from. Write in the comments where you are now and how you feel. I wish you pleasant listening and a peaceful evening. Elena lived by the western wall, where the wind carried the smell of wet grass and lime. She delivered babies, washed bandages for mothers, persuaded old people to drink warm water, keep quiet at noon, and not rush to the wells at the hour when the queue jostled with shoulders. She had simple things: linen thread, a basin, a log with burnt marks, a polished clay mug, and scraps of parchment from the scribe's house. She kept them in a basket, where there was also a wooden whistle for summoning her neighbors. That spring, the fever came before the summer heat. First, a boy from the market fell ill. Then a widow, who lived across the street from the public bathhouse. Then 2 maids at the butcher's. Elena noted this on her rag map. She sewed a different colored edge next to the knots of those who drank from the common ditch. She did not speak loudly. She wrote it down. When the number of knots exceeded 50, she put down her basket and went to the wall, to the drain that ran from the slaughterhouse to the ditch. There were bones stuck in the stone next to the grate. The water smelled of rot. Elena couldn't read long-winded treatises. She knew something else. When people are in a hurry, they take shortcuts. The water carriers, who were paid by the bucket, preferred the short descent to the ditch rather than the distant well at the monastery. The butchers, who had blood flowing every morning, were accustomed to opening the flap and pouring the remains directly into the ditch. She remembered how in winter the water in this place became a greasy film, and in spring children ran there to watch the pigtails float. In the cathedral, the elders spoke of sin. They announced days of fasting, banned fairground dances, and shut down the singers at the taverns. They began to mark doors with red crosses throughout the city, where they saw women making noise at evening gatherings. Someone left a crude charcoal drawing on the wall of the bathhouse and a signature about promiscuity. Elena was there in the morning and saw the boys laughing and throwing mud. She heard from the shopkeepers that on Sunday the elders wanted to judge the guilty women and arrange a public repentance in the square. Elena brought a piece of parchment to the scribe's house. The scribe was lame in his left leg and liked to dry his quills in the sun by the window. He gave her the scraps and said he would write down the names at her request. Elena refused to have them written down. She didn't need them written down, but she needed another kind of help. She asked him for an old wooden ruler with notches and a piece of string. The scribe smiled and, without asking why, gave them to her. He had once been friends with her mother, and out of habit he craned his neck when he saw Elena, as if he wanted to ask her something, but couldn't bring himself to do so. She returned to the moat. She tied the string to a peg and lowered the end into the water with a piece of white cloth. She waited until the rag turned dark, pulled it out, and wrung the cloth into a bowl. The water turned gray. Shiny circles remained on the surface, and the smell stuck to the rag so much that it made her eyes water. She did the same thing at the monastery well. The cloth remained almost clean. Then she went around the houses and noted who was getting water from where. A simple picture emerged. The closer people were to the ditch, the more knots there were on her cloth. She didn't tell anyone about this out loud. She knew that her words would be taken as insolence. She went to the slaughterhouse. The Butcher's Guild sign hung on the gate. A knife and a skin. Bundles of straw soaked in blood lay in the passageway. People in leather aprons dragged carcasses. One of them, a broad-shouldered man, saw Elena and turned away. His name was Peter. He was the son of the master and a man trusted by the elders. Peter was once a boy sitting on the doorstep of Elena's house when his mother gave birth to her second daughter. Elena saved both the mother and the baby. Now he was trying hard to pretend he didn't recognize her. Elena told the master through the doorway, as one would speak to someone who is always busy, that the drain to the ditch was clogged with bones and fat, and that this was not good. The master, without looking, waved his hand as if shooing away a fly. Elena walked on to the water carriers. They stood at the descent to the moat and waited their turn at the barrel. There was one woman among them, thin, with a hooked nose and a string from the barrel leaving a mark on her palm. Her name was Margarita. She remembered Elena from past births and whispered that recently the moat guard had received a penny from the butchers not to raise the grate and let them drain when they were in a hurry. At that time, the elders were gathering for a council meeting. The leader there was Martin, a man in a black hat with thin lips. He liked to repeat words about moral purity. A leather bag with the council's seal hung from his belt. He was a man of order and schedules. He was reluctant to see Elena. He had heard her described as someone who knew where and what hurt, but he believed that women with such occupations were too free in their judgments. Elena came to the cathedral gate and asked to be allowed in for a short report. The guard at the entrance passed on her request. She was told that the council was busy discussing repentance for the guilty. Elena did not leave. She untied the knots on the cloth and spread it out on the stone steps. People entering the morning service stopped and looked. On the cloth, the knots were denser where the streets led to the moat. There were also charcoal marks. An old scribe, the same one with the crooked leg, came out of the cathedral. He said quietly that Martin would not accept her, but there was another way. The scribe knew where the city's book of ordinances was kept and could show the rule about drains and ditches if someone asked him correctly. Elena understood the hint. There was another person in the city, not one of the elders, who sometimes outweighed their power, a merchant from Flanders, the holder of leases on the bridge and the scales. His name was Lambert. He was a stranger, but he had a say in matters of bridge tolls and the cleanliness of the spans because he paid for it. People said he interfered when they prevented him from transporting his goods. Elena knew Lambert by reputation and had once seen his caravan at the eastern gate. He was expected to arrive this week. She went to the bridge and asked the guard if the caravan had arrived. The guard said that the caravan had been delayed because the dams to the north had been washed away. Elena returned without finding her benefactor and decided to take action herself. She gathered her neighbors. She asked them not to go to the moat, to boil water from the monastery well, and to place a basin of vinegar at the entrance to their homes so that people coming in from the street would wipe their hands on a damp cloth. People grumbled. It seemed to them that she was repeating the monastery's habits rather than offering something new. She asked the water carriers to go to the distant well for water and promised to pay for the first 3 buckets herself to be sure. Several women agreed. Several men laughed. At night, Elena heard a rustle at the door. A bundle tied with horsehair lay on the threshold. She picked it up and smelled soot. Inside were torn rags with charcoal. One rag had a crude drawing on it, a female figure by a barrel with a cross above her head. It was an attempt to intimidate her. Elena put the rags in the stove and stoked the coals until they turned to ash. The next morning, a handprint smeared with blood appeared on her door. This was the moment when the family history took a turn she had almost forgotten. Her mother had died long ago. In Elena's chest lay a piece of leather with burnt letters, an inventory of her dowry, once compiled in a small traveling office. At the bottom was a strange mark, a hook next to the letter M. The clerk once said that only one person puts such hooks, Martin, when he checks things for orphans. It turns out that when Elena was very young, her house and her mother's property passed through Martin's hands. Without knowing it, he had once signed papers that deprived Elena of part of the money given for her patronage and transferred it to the city treasury. The clerk suspected that not all of the shortfall had gone where it should have. Elena thought about the vicious circle. Martin, a lover of moral purity, had controlled her family's fate in previous years. Now he wanted public punishment for women. And now the threat had come to Elena's door in the form of rags and a bloody palm. This was the very domestic thriller when a simple night visit became the beginning of a threat. Rumors were circulating in the city that there were people at the slaughterhouse who did not like those who interfered with their work. She went to the drain again. This time, she took Nico with her, a man whom everyone despised. Nico cleaned cesspools. He smelled so bad that people at the market looked away. Nico knew the underground passages better than the guards. Elena asked him to show her where the stream from the slaughterhouse and the moat joined. Nico led her along the edge of the wall to an old hatch near the oak tree. Inside it was damp and cramped. He showed her a stone that could be pried up with a crowbar to block half the flow. He said that if they temporarily closed this stone, the water would flow more slowly into the moat, and some of the dirt would remain in the channel near the slaughterhouse. Elena realized that this was her chance. But without the authorities on her side, no one would allow her to install this damper. She remembered the orderly's book. The old rules did indeed include a clause stating that all dirty drains must flow away from the water intake. The clerk confirmed that such a clause existed. A seal was needed. She went to the monastery. There lived people whom even the elders listened to when it came to wells and cemeteries. The abbot, a man attentive to silence, listened to the clerk. Elena showed him her knots on the canvas and scraps of fabric with muddy water. The abbot said that since there was a well under the monastery wall, the monastery had the right to protect the purity of the water within a radius of the nearest city grate. This meant that he could demand that the grate at the slaughterhouse drain be temporarily closed while the council considered the issue. For the first time in many days, Elena felt that she had leverage. The grate was closed in the morning. The people from the slaughterhouse complained, but a guard with a key was sent from the monastery, and he turned the key in the lock under the gaze of 2 monks. At Elena's request, Nico pried up a stone in the canal and said that it would be enough for 3 days. The water carriers went to the distant well, and Elena gave out mugs for free on the first day, as she had promised. Her neighbors laughed less now. In the evening of the same day, Lambert, the merchant, returned. With him came a clerk with a furtively bound book. The book was his account book. Elena got ready and went to the bridge. She offered Lambert to look at her canvas with knots. He paused and said through his assistant that he had seen people from the slaughterhouse dumping intestines right by the bridge a week ago because they were in a hurry. He had notes in his book. Those days, the scales smelled particularly bad, and the workers ran to wash themselves in the moat. Elena asked him to confirm this at the council meeting the next day. He agreed, and here, the first open turn took place. An outsider with the power of money intervened and changed the course of events. Not because he felt sorry for Elena, but because he needed passability and clean air at the scales. Rumors about the monastery seal, the blocked stone, and Lambert's return reached the elders. Martin sent people to Elena with hints that she was meddling in things that were none of her business. Helena replied through her neighbors that she was not arguing about morals, but looking at the water. She went from house to house and noticed that in 2 days, new knots on the cloth had hardly appeared in those who had stopped taking from the ditch. In those who continued, they appeared. She knew she needed more proof. On the 3rd night, someone tried to break the lock on the grate at the drain. Nico, who was on duty there at Elena's request, heard the grinding and banged his bucket so loudly that the dogs woke up. The people scattered. In the morning, scratches and a piece of leather belt were found on the grate. The belt had a branded mark on it, a knife and a skin. Nico brought the belt to Elena. He held it with 2 fingers, as if it were a viper. Elena realized that her opponents were ready for anything. On the same day, the clerk brought the old inventory, the very one that had once touched Elena's life. He found a copy in the city archives with Martin's signature. In the margins was a note about withholding, for the needs of the orphan fund, an amount equal to the cost of a good cow. The clerk whispered that the cow never made it to the fund. Perhaps the guardian at the time spent it elsewhere, and Martin turned a blind eye or received his share. It was not just an old sin, it was an invisible web of fates. As a child, Elena lost her support because one of the current judges pretended not to see. Elena did not want revenge. She wanted people to stop dying. She stuck to the facts and simple actions. She organized a quarantine on her street, hanging up cloths so that people knew where they could not go, passing bread over the threshold, clay bowls at the entrance for washing hands, refraining from market crowds. The hardest part was convincing mothers to let their children stay home. She explained it in a way that wouldn't offend them. Her neighbors listened to her better than they did the elders because she had been there for them in their hour of need. Rumors about the unclean bathhouse angered the women who went there on Saturdays. Some of the boys started throwing stones at the door. The bathhouse owner locked herself in and cried. Elena came to her and persuaded her to open the back door for those who only needed warm water for the sick. She brought pots and distributed herbs to wash the floors. The elders considered this an act of insolence. It was announced in the square that the guilty women would be punished on Sunday. People began to wait for the spectacle as they wait for a fair. The preparations for this spectacle were the last straw. On the evening before Sunday, Margarita, the water carrier, came to Elena. She walked barefoot, so as not to make a noise with her heels, and held a rope from a barrel in her hand. She said that 2 butchers laughed contemptuously when they saw the monastery seal on the gate, and decided to take a different path at night, opening the old gate downstream, where the staircase had collapsed and no one was on duty. Margarita learned this from her cousin, a boy who delivers bread. Elena went with Nico to that place. They found an old stone dam covered with debris and mud. A little further downstream, the water was rushing more strongly than usual. It was a bypass. Elena realized that if they left it like that, the ditch would take in so much dirt overnight that in the morning everyone would again run for water to the nearest place, and the disease would go around in circles. Nico said that they could put a log across the canal, but the 2 of them couldn't do it. He knew only one person who could make a solid barrier overnight, a carpenter from the lower suburbs, the same one who had been refused payment for repairing the bridge railings a year ago because he did not have a guild seal. His name was Stannis. People talked about him as if he were incompetent because he had no rank. In fact, he knew how to make sturdy things. Nico went to see him. Stannis came with his son and a 2-handed saw. In an hour, they cut down 2 beams and propped them up against the old masonry so that the water could not get past the grate. Elena brought ropes and resin. They worked in the dark, listening to the dry ivy rustling on the walls. It was a night when the underrated hero did what the guild lacked the desire or conscience to do. In the morning, the flow to the moat was weaker. Sunday was supposed to be the day of punishment. But another sound woke everyone up. the clatter of wheels and the cries of carters. Lambert's caravan entered the city. He stopped at the scales and ordered the warehouses to be opened. This movement distracted people from the square. The elders were rushing about. Martin wanted to postpone the verdict of guilt, but Lambert, as the holder of bridge tolls and scales, had the right to close the bridge temporarily if conditions were harmful to goods. He said through the clerk that the stench from the moat was interfering with the scales and showed the marks in his book. The council took note of these marks. Martin pressed his lips together. Elena came to the council, not as a petitioner, but as the one who had kept the records. She placed a rag with knots on it, followed by a bowl of water from the moat and a bowl of water from the monastery well. She placed a belt with the guild's mark, found on the grate, and a broken hook from the lock next to them. The scribe opened the book of ordinances at the section on drains. The abbot said that the monastery required clean water because people drew from the well, and that it pained the monks to see children with feverish foreheads. Lambert confirmed that his cargo was spoiling from the stench and that he was paying the city money not to drown in filth. Nico stepped back so as not to smell in the middle of the meeting, but when asked, he showed where the canal could be repaired. Thus, imperceptibly, the gathering became a trial of the real culprits. The elders, pressed by the facts, ordered an inspection of the slaughterhouse and the drainage channels. 2 guards, a clerk, and another man from the council, named Oswald, who was famous for not envying other people's words, but loved to look at stones, went to the site. He saw the mud flowing along the old bypass, and realized that someone had tried to divert the flow during the night. Oswald was not a friend of Elena's, but he loved order. Words about debauchery no longer applied to this picture. Martins tried to turn everything back. He announced that the charges against the women would not be dropped and that the terrible misfortune required repentance. But his voice sounded hollow when the bowls of water were in front of his eyes. People sniffed and turned away. The herbalists, who were afraid to speak openly against the elders, approached Elena and whispered their gratitude. The mother of the boy from the market brought her a loaf of bread. Margarita took the cord off her palm and said that for the first time in many days, she had walked to the distant well without fear, because she knew she would not be abandoned. The dispute lasted until noon, and then something happened that had been quietly hinted at by the world of things. A chest with city seals and books was brought out through a side door. Oswald took one out and held it up to the light. Under Martin's signature, dated the year when Elena was still very young, there was an additional mark and an expense entry for the orphan fund. The clerk said that the trail of money in the book disappeared on the line where this entry stood. No one said the word theft aloud, but the eyes of many said it aloud. Elena felt the past coming together with the present, not because she wanted to punish Martin, but because all the pieces had fallen into place. The man who now craved public repentance from strangers had once taken a cow from a child. That child had become a midwife who was now saving her neighbors from fever. This was the hidden kinship, not literal blood, but a bond of fate through action. Martin had once touched her life and, without meaning to, raised the one who now stopped him. The council decided to close the slaughterhouse drains until further review, to open a spare drain behind the wall along the old dam, to guard the grates and manholes, to post a guard from the monastery and from the scales, to prohibit taking water from the moat, to put a barrier with a chain on the descent. On the streets where there are many knots on Elena's canvas, a 7-day quarantine was to be imposed. Bread and water were to be brought to the doorstep. The market was to be rebuilt. Goods were to be sold from tables at a distance, and baths were to be opened only for washing the sick, without communal steam rooms, and with soap made from ash and fat, which was to be provided free of charge from the monastery and guild supplies. The Butchers' Guild shall be obliged to pay a fine to the orphan fund and for the repair of the well. This decision did not come about by chance. It came from small actions, from a rag, a string, a bowl, knots, beams, a key in a lock, and someone else's book with notes. It came from people's choices. Nico, who was despised, became the one who knew the flow of water. Stanis, who was considered weak, became the one who held the beam where the breach was. Margarita, who was pushed into the moat, brought news that changed the night. The scribe, who was called a dry biscuit, helped find the lines in the book where the cow was hidden. The abbot, who loved silence, applied the seal. Lambert, a stranger but attentive to the clean air at the scales, became an unexpected benefactor. The quarantine bore fruit in the city. The knots on Elena's canvas stopped multiplying. Those that remained gradually filled with small notes about recovery. She walked quietly, placed grains under the tongues of those who were losing consciousness, heated water, placed bowls at the doorstep, came to the house where people had recently been laughing, and saw the elderly thank her with tears in their eyes, without words. She did not demand obeisance. She asked people to remove trash from the door and not to throw sausage scraps into the ditch. The elders moved the spectacle to the square for an indefinite period. Where the guilty women were supposed to stand, they set up a table with bowls of water. On the table lay 2 rags, one gray from the ditch, the other clean from the well. Under the table was a basket with clay for washing hands. No one came to watch the repentance. People went for bread and water and returned home. They began to clean up the slaughterhouse. Peter, the master's broad-shouldered son, came to Elena's door at night. He did not dare to knock. He stood there for a moment and then left. In the morning, when Elena was carrying a bucket to the house of a woman with a fever, he was nearby. He didn't say a word. He just took the bucket from her hands and carried it to the doorstep. Then he left, leaving an unmarked leather belt at the door. A week later, he gave the city supervisor a list of people who had come to the gate at night. He wrote it poorly, with mistakes, but he wrote for a long time, as if every mark on the paper was a confession. The master kicked him out of the workshop for a month, but Peter stayed in the city and got a job as an assistant to the supervisor. He paid for his silence during the first week. Martins, pressed against the wall, did not publicly ask for forgiveness. He went home and closed his shutters before anyone else. Someday, he would face another court. But the city already knew what they had been afraid to say before. Sometimes the problem is not how people dance at the fair, but that someone respected turns a blind eye to the canal at the slaughterhouse. Elena continued her work. She sewed new knots because life does not stop. In her chest, there was an old inventory with a hook next to the letter M. She did not burn it. She left it as proof that destinies are connected not by blood, but by deeds. 7 days after the council's decision, a large crowd gathered at the monastery well. The abbot ordered a wooden shield with burned-in rules to be placed next to the well. Do not take water from the ditch. Do not throw entrails into the common ditches. Ventilate your homes. If you have a fever, do not go to the market and ask your neighbors to bring bread to your doorstep. Wash your face before entering the house. A tree was planted nearby. Nico, who usually stood in the shade, came up and touched the bark as if it were a miracle. Stanis said he could make a roof over the sign so that the rain would not wash away the letters. Lambert promised to provide the boards. The baths opened 10 days later, but without the boys shouting at the porch. A rag with herbs hung on the door. The bathhouse owner kept hot water for the sick and handed out soap. The women stopped whispering about shame and started whispering about how to make a decoction to wash the floors. Margarita, the water carrier, stopped tying the rope to her palm. She made the loop wider so that there would be no cuts. People gave her space at the market. Once she stood in line at the well and hurried. Now she carried the barrels to the distant well and received more money for it than before because people understood the value of clean water. Elena established a simple order on her street. A string of tiny knots hung at each doorstep, a sign that everyone in the house was alive. If someone was sick, the knot was untied and tied again only after recovery. It was a quiet count, understandable without words. Only by autumn did the town notice that the number of new knots on Elena's cloth was approaching 0. She began to be called upon for advice, not as a supplicant, but as someone who knew how to arrange things humanely. Oswald, the one who loved to look at stones, once said that there was nothing more useful in his life than putting a dam at the outlet. He asked Elena for her rag for a while to show it to people from a neighboring town. She gave it to him. And what happened to those who were waiting for the spectacle of repentance? Their interest shifted to where bread was sold. They realized that life was easier when you didn't have to shout in the square. They saw a child from the market running after pigeons by the scales again. They saw an old man by the wall smiling, even though he hadn't gotten out of bed last month. They heard flutes playing again in the evenings, but not by the bathhouse, but by the house where a woman who had lost her husband sat. They brought her music, not for noise, but for silence. The city was alive. The city had learned its lesson without loud words. Not from moral sermons, but from bowls of water, from rope, from beams, and from how one woman was not afraid to count the knots and go to those who were not loved. If anyone asked what to call it, people replied that it was not a miracle or punishment, but order and care. Elena returned to childbirth and to the nightly knocks on the door without fear. She knew that threats happen, that rags with coal can be left on the doorstep. But she saw how a visit that was meant to be a threat became just another line in a long work. One evening, a woman came to her who, back in that first week, had found a bloody handprint on her door. She brought Elena a small loaf of bread and said that she too was keeping score, a score of kindness. She noted how Nico dragged the bucket, even though they waved him away, how Stannis held the beam while his legs trembled, how Lambert stood at the council, even though he could have gone further and thought only of his goods. Elena smiled and asked herself without words where people found the strength for such changes. The answer was obvious. The strength came from necessity, from pure water. In winter, they removed the first beam and put up a stone partition at the new diversion. Stannis received silver for this. Nico received the right not to pay tax on buckets. Margarita received a place next to the monastery well. The scribe received a place by the window closer to the sun. The abbot received peace and quiet. Lambert received clean air at the scales and did not delay the caravans. The city received order. Martins remained in his house. He no longer spoke loudly in the square. When the orphan fund was opened and its contents were counted, people asked where the shortfall from previous years was. No one said wine, but everyone understood. Elena did not go to watch the counting. She was more concerned about the 2 houses on her street where people were still coughing. In the spring, Elena unfolded a new rag. She did not draw new maps on it. She held the threads on it so that they lay flat. In the houses on her street, children laughed again. They no longer drew with charcoal near the bathhouse. A tree now grew near the wall, where it had previously smelled of rot. The leaves rustled like the clothes of a healthy person in the wind, simply and calmly. When someone started saying again that trouble comes from debauchery, people replied without malice that trouble comes from dirty water. They knew this now, not because they had read a book, but because they had seen the bowl and the rag with their own eyes. So the story ended not by chance, but by choice, not by miracle, but by hard work, not by loud punishment, but by quiet order. And if you look for a moral in it, it is that justice does not fall from above, but is gathered from small actions that everyone can do, and also in the fact that those who are despised often know where the real road lies, and that a stranger with a purse can become an unexpected benefactor if the air in the scales is important to him, and that one person's old decision can come back years later and become a knot in someone else's rag, which will be untied not by shouting, but by water from a clean well. The midwife saved not only the children, she saved the habit of living peacefully. She left people a simple sign: a bowl, a rope, knots, a beam, a seal. This was enough to calm the panic, to prevent pogroms, to keep control of sexuality where it belonged, in empty words that lost their power in front of a wet rag that smelled not of coal and fear, but of clean water.